Hello and welcome to another one of my videos. In this video I wanted to talk about the specific topics of punishment, guilt, and shame. With guilt and shame, I would say those are two things that are very prominent in our society today and in our own minds. And I guess we can start off by talking about why the human mind does guilt and shame. Why does it create those feelings? And a lot of people have probably thought about this, and I know when I was in church, I grew up in the Mormon church, which may be kind of a weird thing for some people if they're not in Utah, but if you're in Utah, it's not a weird thing. I'd say most of my friends, a lot of people I know, have at least some association with the Mormon church, but the ideals are essentially the same as any religion, in that I specifically remember learning that guilt and shame were kind of tools to create change in your life. So basically, if you feel guilty and you feel shame, then you should use that as a fuel source to change your actions. And at the time learning that, it seemed very logical. And I would say a lot of people, even people who weren't raised in religious communities, still may have thought of that idea before, that is sort of the reason for guilt and for shame, is to create change. But these feelings can definitely go overboard in a lot of different people. They can become more harmful than good. And my whole theory behind this is that because we used to be, and still are, a very group-oriented species. We're very tribalistic, and we need each other for the whole thing to work. So if you do something to mess with the whole group or mess with other people, and you create a bad circumstance for other people, then evolutionarily speaking, it's more beneficial for your mind to create guilt and shame, because if you don't care about hurting other people, then you're just gonna, you're gonna end up screwing over the whole tribe and killing everyone. So I think that's why the feeling of guilt and shame has become such a strong thing for humans, is because it's strictly evolutionary. It's an evolutionary advantage for us to feel bad for hurting our own species. Like if you think about it, probably one of the worst feelings that you could have as a human being is to accidentally do something to ruin the life of another human being. Like, let's say you're just driving, you look over your shoulder and someone says something to you, you look away real quick and you look and boom, you smack into someone, a pedestrian, and they're dead. Like, it's hard to imagine a feeling that would actually be more uncomfortable than that. Like, if you ruined your own life, it would suck, but to me it seems that hurting someone else, whether on purpose or out of anger or by accident, is probably one of the worst feelings that you could have. And I would suggest that that's an evolutionary thing, which probably helped us a lot up until this point. And the reason I say up until this point is because I see personally a lot of negative things coming from an excessive guilt and excessive shame in people. And it used to be more important that, like, the excessive guilt and excessive shame probably was good for us when surviving was difficult. But now, in today's world, surviving is one of the easiest things we do. So, but yet we still have the programming. We're still programmed to react as if it's totally up to our survival to feel guilt and shame. We still have that programming from millions and millions of years of straight up survival to get to this point. And now we pretty much dominate. We're at the top of the food chain. Surviving is definitely extremely easy for us. Thought of where I was going to take this. One second, let me remember. So, I think one of the biggest negative effects of this excessive guilt and excessive shame is addiction. I think it's straight across the board. Excessive guilt and excessive shame in a lot of people leads directly to addiction, which is kind of interesting because addiction is a fairly new thing in our society, in our species. We used to not have access to all the different sources of pleasure that we do now, and it doesn't matter what you're addicted to: video games, TV, some sort of drugs, even addicted to like self-pity or any sort of emotional addictions of thoughts looping in your mind. I guess that could have existed in the past, but what I mostly mean is the more harmful addictions like opiates and other drugs like that actually can ruin your life, and kill you or things like that. But what happens is people begin to feel this excessive guilt and excessive shame, and they actually start to think that they're a bad person, which, I've in my past, I've felt guilt and shame for no reason before. I've seen that happen in my mind. I watched the guilt come up before it had a reason, and then I've watched my mind try and look for a reason to justify the feeling, which you can usually always find one. So what I'm suggesting is that possibly the human mind is programmed, not everyone of course, but it's programmed to feel guilty almost regardless of what's happening. It's probably been healthy to our survival to kind of just get a dose of guilt every once in a while, just to kind of keep us in line. And then our thoughts will just look for something to justify it and say, okay, I need to fix that. And even if it's something tiny, which I would say in today's world, a lot of it is really tiny. Sometimes we feel the most guilt and most shame just for something we said to someone, like just a moment of where we lost control, got a little bit angry, and we said something, and now we've spent the past 5-10 years regretting that and holding this sort of resentment, whether against them or against ourselves, for something so tiny. Like if you compare that on the scale of surviving or not surviving, just saying one wrong thing or a couple wrong things to someone is such a minuscule event. But yet we can feel guilt and feel shame and embarrassment and all these really powerful emotions for so long after that. So I think that these emotions can have their uses. I definitely can't deny guilt or shame or embarrassment or any of these negative emotions. It gets to a point where it kind of creates this feedback loop where it's actually just making things worse. Like I've known a lot of instances, and even in myself in some cases, to where, especially when it comes to addiction, because that's such a looked down upon thing, and it's something we look down upon ourselves for a lot too, because we know how dumb it is. We know it just doesn't make sense, but yet like we're doing it anyway. So it's so easy to create such a negative self-image of yourself if you become addicted to something, because you think that you should have the power to stop it, and you think that you're weak for not being able to stop it. And then guilt comes in, sometimes extremely powerful, you know, and then it's usually not it. Sometimes it can be directly leading into it to we know that we are going to our addiction to avoid the feeling of guilt. I would say in most cases there's kind of like we feel guilty and then it kind of like sneaks off into our subconscious, and then it later on it just kind of comes out as like, oh, let's do our addiction now, and it just like it kind of like doesn't fully register in the person's mind that they are going to their addiction to avoid something. They just know that going to their addiction will relieve whatever is happening. You know, it's so it can be conscious and it can be subconscious. But I would say that a lot of the times the guilt and the shame push people right back into their addiction, which pushes people right back into their guilt, which pushes people right back into their addiction, which pushes people right back into their guilt. So it becomes this endless cycle. So in that case, I would say that the guilt and the shame are completely useless, and I would even suggest that they're harmful to the situation and to getting the person out of that bad situation, which our society doesn't usually. I mean, I guess it depends on where you look, but to me it seems like our biggest solution to a problem, to a person that's kind of fucking up, they're kind of ruining their life. Sorry if you don't like swear words. I do swear pretty often in my daily life, so. But one of our society's biggest solutions to the problem of someone screwing up is to try and put it in their face of how bad it is to be doing what they're doing. I see it all the time. It's like, how could you be doing this? Didn't you think about this? Like, what if this happens? And to a person who's already drowning in guilt, that is only going to make it worse. And they already know. That's the thing. Most people already know. It's not very difficult to think of all the negative consequences that could come from you messing up. Like, that's one of your main jobs of your brain, is to constantly evaluate all the negative things that could be happening from the decisions that you're making. So I would suggest that if you are in this situation, or if you see other people in this situation, that the stacking on of more guilt and more shame, it's at least worth considering that may not be the right answer for some people. Now, that doesn't mean that we switch everything completely over to the other side and become an enabler, but there's a sweet spot somewhere right in the middle where we're not letting them take advantage of us, we're not letting them get away with things, but we're also not making them believe that they're a shitty person. Because that seems to be one of our main ways of teaching people, is and a lot of it's our own insecurities that we want to get at them because we're angry. So then that anger turns into trying to make them feel bad. And if we actually really looked at what we're doing, we're actually trying to make ourselves feel better by making them feel bad about what they're doing, but we kind of disguise it as we're trying to help them. But if we were really trying to help them, the only way, once it gets to this really bad point where people are so low, the only route is understanding. It's compassion and understanding, not more punishment. See, because punishment it's a very low-tech way of communicating with someone. It's a very crude way to try and communicate with another person or animal or something. It's like with a dog or something. I kind of believe that, you know, maybe they should be punished sometimes. Maybe even you smack them a little bit every once in a while. It's because they don't have the ability to communicate. So we have to resort down to these lower tech sort of levels of communication. And because you have to tell them what's wrong. You have to let them know, like, that regardless of how high tech or how good you are at communicating, you still have to get the message across that what they're doing is not acceptable. Like if your dog poops on your floor, one way or another, you got to get them to not do that anymore. So with a dog, really the only way that I can think of is to either yell at them a lot. There's probably, some different things that you can do to make them get shocked or like taste really bad things or smell bad things or something. But with a dog, you have to create that an unpleasurable experience in order to communicate to them, because that's the only type of communication they understand. You can't speak words to them. I mean, maybe a dog can understand a few words after you've been with them for a long time, a lot of training, but you really can't communicate that directly with a dog, or any animal for that matter. But with a person, as our species is evolving more and more, we are getting to the point where we can communicate very, very specific ideas and details, because really you don't need to create a feeling of dissatisfaction in a person to get them to change. Because if they really fully understood where you were coming from, and not just saying that they understand, but if they genuinely understood that what they're doing is not beneficial and not going anywhere good and isn't even a valid escape, if they fully understood that, then there would be no need for punishment in order to get that message across. And I mean, in our society now, one of the main ways that we have to teach people that they're messing up in life is by putting them in jail, which I think a lot of people don't really fully think of all the way through, because we all have our different ideas of what should be legal and what should be illegal, because we say, all right, we want this and we don't want this, and we think that if we make it illegal, that it will make the problem be less, because we're saying, there's a punishment if you do it. But if we think it all the way through, like, we're literally we're taking them from their life and putting them inside of a cage. That's what it means if something's illegal. We think that, or we're basically saying that that person deserves to be put in a cage, and also, to add another layer onto it, we want our tax dollars to pay for their life, their ability to live, their food and their shelter. So we're saying that we want to take them from a life where they could possibly be being productive in some way, put them in a situation where they have no ability to be productive, and we also want to pay for them to be doing that. That just doesn't add up fully to me in a lot of different circumstances. Obviously, there is the main reason why we created jail is to get people that are harming society and get them away from us, put them in a place where they can't harm anymore. But I think, I don't want to go into this specific topic too deeply with this video. Looks like you're not focused. There we go. But I think it's important to consider, is somebody harming more than just themselves? I don't think that we should put people in jail for using drugs, or most things to do with, no, I mean, yeah, it's mostly the drug thing, because I would say that a lot of, I think I don't know the numbers exactly, but probably 50% of people are in jail for using drugs. And if we bring this point back to where I was, there's hardly anything more shameful than going to jail. So you're taking somebody that is probably already drowning in guilt, you're slapping on a little more guilt, which is technically the source of the addiction, most likely, and you're putting them into a group of a bunch of other drug dealers and drug users, and they're supposed to come out not wanting to do drugs anymore. To me, that seems like there's a lack of understanding of what's really going on in that situation. There's just the thought that we need to cause something more bad in their life to get them to understand that what they're doing is bad, and then that's going to somehow fix the problem. To me, it just, I can kind of imagine like a metaphor of burning a very inefficient source of fuel, a very like dirty fuel source. And that's what I think what guilt and shame is, and punishment. It's like it's just burning like a very dirty fuel source, which does kind of get you what you want, but there's the negative side to it. There's such a powerful negative side to it, which is what we're dealing with right now, because we are a society that has grown off of guilt, punishment, and shame in order to kind of correct people. And now we're dealing with the problem of addiction, and probably a bunch of other problems too, suicide and all that. So I think we could all, first of all, look at ourself. Look at, are we, if we're talking about addressing people that have these problems, are we trying to get, are we trying to resolve our anger by stacking on guilt? You know, because first of all, that problem needs to be looked at. Are we trying to get something out of it, some sort of justice or like satisfaction or revenge or something from these people that may have treated us wrong or may have just done so much bad in their life that we feel like they need, you know, there needs to be justice served, like, because I feel like that needs to be looked at first if this problem is ever going to be resolved. But also just look at the way that we are trying to teach people. Are we to a point where we are skillful enough at communicating that we don't have to use such a crude form of communicating that we use on animals because they don't understand? Or can we elevate our level of communication to a point where we can get the same point across without the negative consequences? Because that's what I am personally trying to address here, is the negative side to it. Because even if we get them to solve their problem through guilt and shame, there's still all the negative consequences of burning such a, like a bad, dirty source of fuel. So even if we get what we want, or get what we think should happen, get what we think is a good thing to happen, there's still the scars left from the guilt and the shame and the belief that they are a bad person, which of course can be dealt with, can be addressed, but it just depends on whether that person's mind is ready for something like that or not. So if there's someone in your life that is, you can kind of correlate a lot of these things that I'm talking about, then I would suggest, as a first step, maybe even kind of just drop the idea that they need to change at all. I mean, we may think that it's better if they change, or that they should change, or that the world needs people to change, but I mean, that's really just a concept coming from our human perspective. You know, I would suggest that technically nothing really needs to change. And see, a lot of this clashes with religious ideals and things like that, of getting into heaven or going to hell, or like things like that. We think that the things that happen in this life are so important that our eternal soul is at stake here. And I personally think that's a very unhealthy way to live life and to treat people. Because then no matter what, we think that they have to change, and that it's such an important thing that we're willing to make them feel guilty about it so that they can change. But I would subtly ask the question, am I sure that they actually need to be different than they are, or that I need to be different than I am? Am I positive about that? Can I create any sort of hints of doubt around that? Maybe I don't know everything. And even if you are a religious person, maybe this is how God decided it should be. How do I know that this situation for sure needs to change? And if you can see where I'm coming from that, you can probably start to feel kind of just like, oh, it's a little bit of a release just from that one idea. I am not positive that this isn't exactly how it's supposed to happen. I have no idea. And if you're being totally honest with yourself, you can at least arrive at that point that I do not know how this should be. I know how I want it to be, I know how I think it should be, but I really do not know how this should be. I don't know how anything in life should be. And then if you still feel, which I'm not saying this should or shouldn't be any other way, but if you still feel like there's something to address, then I would just try it, whether you're addressing yourself, you're addressing your own thoughts, your own minds, or you're addressing another person that has an addiction problem or a depression problem or a self-loathing, guilt sort of problem that's creating a lot of other problems stemming from that. I would suggest coming at it from a point of compassion and a point of understanding and relating. But like I said, there has to be that sweet spot. You can't lean over to enabling, and you can't, like, anywhere on the far right or the far left is not where you want to be. You want to be right in the center where you are. It's a balance of both. It's a balance of both. Like I said, you want to communicate this because the whole point of the communication is to tell them that you think it would be a more beneficial route if they didn't continue doing these things, or if you didn't continue doing these things. So that's the part that needs to be communicated. But step up your level of communication and understanding, and I would suggest that people are a lot more willing to listen if you've been listening to them first, and they feel that you at least understand kind of where they're coming from. That's usually going to be a much more effective conversation if you start with you listening to them. But also, like I said, you can't get to a point where they're trying to manipulate you or something like that. And when it comes to dealing with your own guilt and your own repetitive thoughts that can't go away, there's just a lot of different questions that you can ask as to whether those thoughts are true or not. Am I actually a bad person? And like the question I suggested earlier, how do I know that this isn't exactly the way it was supposed to go? Now, that can't be used as an excuse to continue, obviously, but it can be used as a reason to calm the guilt that we stack on ourselves so strongly, which in turn, and we probably know this, we know the guilt leads to the escape. If we stack on the guilt, it's most likely going to lead to us trying to escape that through addiction of any kinds. I think just kind of the realization that life isn't supposed to be perfect, and really there is no such thing as perfect. And it sucks because I don't want to attack religion in any sort of way, but to me, it seems that if we hold on to our religious ideals and beliefs, there may not really be a way to get out of feeling guilty because we think that we actually screwed up and that we're actually going to be punished in the afterlife because of this. Which I would suggest is completely 100% bullshit. But obviously, me saying that probably isn't going to change a whole lot. But if you have any trust for what I'm saying, I would say that I have no belief in that whatsoever. Not in karma. I don't think we're going to be resurrected into a shittier life if we screwed up this life. I think that's complete bullshit. And I think the idea of heaven and hell, at least in the sense that however good or bad we acted in this life is going to determine our next life, I think that is complete bullshit as well. And I don't really want to make this video about free will or about choices or anything. I may make another video on that topic, but I think it's very helpful to question the ideas of like, did I choose this life? Did I choose my DNA? Did I choose my brain? Like, do I even choose the thoughts that come into my mind? I mean, there's so much relief in that idea that I personally have gotten that I would love to kind of share with other people, but that is one of the most resisted ideas that a person can have, is that we're not in control of our life, because that's what our entire identity is constructed around. If we think that we're a good person, it's because we think that we have made good choices as opposed to someone else who has made bad choices. So in order to question the idea of free will, we have to question that our entire life story and all the good that we've done and all the bad that we've done, and question whether that was us that did that or if that's just what happened. So maybe I'll go into that with my next video, but I hope that I shared some ideas that were interesting to hear. And yeah, I don't really want to give any advice. Like I'll say in a lot of my videos, I'm not really trying to give anyone any tasks or anything to really do or change, because like I said, the whole idea of this, kind of the relaxation, is in the idea that not everything might not necessarily need to change. Because I think it's the need to change that can justify why we stack guilt on ourselves and stack guilt on other people. If we feel that something dire is so dire that it needs to change, that it's so important that it needs to change, then we can almost always justify being mean, stacking the guilt on someone or ourselves. We can almost always justify that if we feel that it's extremely important. So I'm here to suggest that maybe it's not so important that things need to change. And it's funny because the ironic part of that is the relaxation of that can lead to change. But it's because we think it's so important that's actually getting in the way of the change. And I'm going to share a lot of ideas that are completely backwards like that. It's maybe one of my favorite concepts is seeing things that are completely backwards and pointing out those things. All right. Thank you for watching another one of my videos. Please subscribe if you liked it. I'll be posting more, one or two every week. Yeah, thanks.